when we solve problems using our own biases. To remedy this, we as designers can determine which populations are excluded from a certain product's design process. To begin thinking about this, we should look into what exactly constitutes a disability. How do we define a disability, and how has that definition changed over time, and how should we use this in our design process? So from 1980 to today, the definition of disability has changed from being a personal attribute to being context dependent. So in 1980, the World Health Organization defined a disability as any restriction or lack of ability to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. So we can see here that this definition kind of separates being normal and disabled, but today we define disability as not just a health problem. So instead, it's kind of a complex phenomenon which reflects the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which they live. So to kind of summarize, disability is not a personal health condition, but rather the result of what can be a series of mismatched human interactions. Disability can happen at various points of interaction between a person and society, and as designers, it's our job to explore how these designs create mismatches. So to look deeper into how these mismatches can affect individuals, we as designers can look into the different types of exclusion caused by these mismatches. Identifying the types of exclusion and how they differ is key to recognizing exclusion and taking action faster. So here we've highlighted what we find as three primary types of exclusion: permanent, temporary, and situational. So if we're kind of considering touch as the overall area of mismatch, an individual with one arm would be an example of someone facing a permanent exclusion. So usually we tend to think of individuals facing permanent exclusion first and foremost while designing, and their interactions with the world are often heavily impacted. Next, we have temporary exclusion, which would include someone who has an arm injury, for example, in this case. This short-term injury could temporarily affect how they interact with the world around them. And finally, we have a situational exclusion, which usually has something to do with an individual's environment. So in this case, we have an example of a new parent whose one hand and arm is usually occupied with holding their baby and caring for it. So as individuals facing situational exclusion move through different environments, their abilities can change dramatically. So now we pose a question to you guys. Can you think of any other examples of permanent, temporary, or situational exclusion? As a hint, try to first narrow down on a potential area of mismatch, such as the ones we provide here, and then think about how these mismatches could occur. Feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. Anyone have an idea? Okay, I can try thinking of one for starters. One that I can think of, if we take hearing as the potential mismatch, someone who is deaf or hard of hearing would be facing some kind of permanent exclusion, and someone who has an ear infection could be facing a temporary exclusion because their hearing is temporarily affected. Someone with an accent could be hard to understand. Yes, so that would be like speaking, would be the mismatch. Yeah, that's a good one. Carlos, would that be like a permanent, temporary, or situational exclusion? Which do you think that would be? Yeah, permanent. Yeah, I would say permanent or maybe even situational, depending on their environment, who they're interacting with. Yeah. Yeah, Hannah said, speaking a certain language and going to a different country that speaks a different primary language. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, this is a great example. We'll go ahead and move on to the second principle here, which is learning from diversity. So humans, we can consider ourselves as kind of the real experts in adapting to diversity. So as designers, we need fresh and diverse perspectives to really make inclusive design work. So the key here is learning from how we adapt. So humans are always adapting, and as designers, it's important to try and take advantage of this. When digital or physical experiences don't work for people, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this, they adapt in ways that we can never think about. So it's important to understand the emotional context of these decisions, what gives people joy, what frustrates them, to understand why individuals make certain decisions as they interact with the world. And during this process, empathy is super critical. Sometimes it's misleading to rely only on simulating different abilities using blindfolds and earplugs, for example. To learn from diversity, we really need to understand how people adapt from their own perspective. So the third and final inclusive design principle we'll be covering is the practice of solving for one and extending to many. So this involves focusing on common human motivations and what's universally important for all of us. So solving for one and extending to many starts with identifying universal experiences. Inclusive design works across a spectrum of abilities. So there are universal ways in which humans interact with the world around them. We all have abilities and limits to those abilities, and we all do experience inclusion to varying extents. From here, we can think about universal solutions that could benefit a great number of people. For example, a solution that works well for someone who's blind might also end up benefiting someone who's driving a car. One example that we all use and frankly take advantage of is closed captioning. So closed captioning was actually first created to benefit individuals who are hard of hearing, but we all do make use of it today as it helps prevent situational exclusion, such as when you're in a noisy environment or something like that. As such, designing for individuals with permanent disabilities should not be seen as a constraint, but rather an opportunity. So more inclusive design will end up benefiting a larger population. If we continue with the arm example, we see from the image on the right that there are about 26,000 people who have one arm, 13 million who have a temporary arm injury, and 8 million who are new parents with a situational exclusion, totaling to 21 million or more potential people to benefit with a universal solution. Another example I can think of a universal solution is high contrast screen settings, which were initially created to benefit people with vision impairments. However, we all use the brightness settings on our phone when using a device in bright sunlight or on contrast in the dark. So remember that designing with constraints in mind is just simply designing well and effectively. So we can kind of represent the scaling of a universal solution by using what we call the persona spectrum, which kind of shows how a solution can scale to a broader audience, as you see here in this picture. This presents motivations across the spectrum of permanent, temporary, and situational scenarios. And when designing inclusively, we also want to keep in mind what we call the persona network, which includes friends, coworkers, family members, or even strangers of individuals who are part of the persona spectrum. So this network will also be affected by our designs and products, which is super important to keep in mind. To review, recognizing exclusion, learning from diversity, and solving for one and extending to many are a few key stepping stones to designing inclusively.
All right, now let's talk about inclusive design in the real world. An example of inclusive design in the world of physical products is tactile marks on shampoo bottles. They help those with visual impairments differentiate between shampoo and conditioner bottles. So remember that everything in the world has been designed. Design is in everything we use, see, and hear. So although we may associate design with graphic design, UI, UX, design thinking is applicable to all things that appeal to our senses, like shampoo bottles. Another example of an inclusively designed product is a restroom sign. As you can see on the bottom of the sign, there is a gender-neutral symbol, a wheelchair symbol, and Braille at the bottom. Bathroom signs haven't always been this inclusive, so this is an example of how products can evolve to be more inclusive considering the wide range of human experience. This sign is inclusive to those who may prefer a gender-neutral bathroom or those who may have a disability. This last example is a classic case of digital inclusive design. So iOS has thorough accessibility settings, including VoiceOver, being able to adjust display and text sizes, closed captioning, spoken content, and being able to connect to other devices.
So now we'll be moving on to inclusive design practices. But before doing that, we're going to take a moment to ask, what are some things that can make designs inclusive? Feel free to type in chat or raise your hand to speak out loud. A personal example I like is like Apple's, or I guess emojis in general, when they started incorporating different skin tone. I thought that was just more inclusive, and I appreciate also how they have kind of a like neutral, like yellow emoji for everyone to use.
Another one could be like Google Translate or other translating softwares, like adding more languages.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Does anyone else have any other ideas or things they'd like to share? Oh yeah, colorblind modes is really good. I'm not sure if you guys know the website Coolers. It's like something you can use for like getting color palettes, but they actually have this thing that allows you to kind of enable a mode that lets you see colors from different types of color blindness. And I think it's pretty inclusive and really nice of them to include that. In case you couldn't think of any ideas, here are some different ways you could make designs more inclusive. So you could use distinct colors and contrast, simple language, logical, easy to follow layout, readable font size to make sure that text has been magnified, describe links comprehensively, enable keyboard navigation for those who might not be able to use a mouse, incorporate subtitles, and use descriptive alternative tags. And of course, designing websites for screen readers is a good one. Oh dang, you guys have really good ideas. But yeah, those are all really good ideas. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so moving on to one of the key practices for inclusive design is to design with others. So the practice is to design with excluded and diverse communities rather than for them. I know this might sound a little bit strange, seeing how empathy is so important in the design process, but as a designer, you won't always be able to understand a user's feelings or experiences. It might be hard for you to empathize with a community or experience you aren't familiar with. And that's why it's better to include diverse communities in your design process. Rather than trying to solve problems for others, give them the opportunity to directly guide your design. Gathering input from those who may have been excluded in the past is vital in ensuring that you properly represent their voices and stories in your design. Okay, and so moving on to the next practice, accessibility. Speaking from the perspective as a digital designer, accessible technology makes the digital world available for everyone. Considering the accessibility of your products and designs allows you to be more inclusive of those who may have difficulties accessing your designs otherwise. Digital accessibility can be seen in tools such as voice-powered features like text-to-speech and screen readers. And so next we'll go over 4 different ways to make your designs more accessible. So starting with alt text, which is also known as alternative text. This is text that appears when a web page doesn't load properly and the images aren't displayed, or when a screen reader is used to read a screen. Screen readers will read any text attached to the images as alt text. And alt text also improves image CEOs and could help search crawlers identify your images. Most programs have options for you to add alt text, such as Word in the image shown below. And then as an example of alt text, we have an image on the right. So an okay example of alt text would be just pancakes for this, but to improve it, we could describe it as a stack of blueberry pancakes with powdered sugar. The goal of alt text is to be descriptive and give users the ability to visualize an image without actually seeing it. Okay, and so next we have color contrast. And this is a difference in brightness between the foreground and background colors. So higher contrast results in a more accessible experience and better user experience overall. As shown in the example to the right, so we have high contrast in the top left square with the black text and the yellow background. And then if you want better visibility, we have at the top right, white text on a dark blue background. And the bottom two are kind of examples of poor contrast and poor visibility. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that there's dark green text on a red background. And this kind of makes it seem like the text is vibrating somehow. And a useful tool for checking color contrast is Site Improves Color Contrast Checker. With this website, you can simply just input your hex code and it'll tell you if your colors pass like the contrast ratio standards. And next, there's also customizable settings. This might be a little bit difficult to implement because you have to kind of take into account a lot of different settings and how it'll affect the layout of pages, but it's definitely worth the time. Customizable settings allows users to adjust colors and font sizes for better visibility, as well as remove animations or graphics that might cause issues in navigating through apps. Apple has an extensive settings features that allows users to like almost entirely completely customize their mobile experience to their liking. For instance, when a user is using a screen reader, they will be using VoiceOver, which is a feature that reads out loud the text and navigation options. Apple allows users to adjust the speed of their voiceovers to their preference. So if you can see the little turtle, the little turtle and the rabbit, putting it at the turtle makes the speaking rate slower while the rabbit makes it speak faster. And so feel free to explore Apple settings on your own phone if you have an Apple phone, or read through Apple's accessibility settings as linked in the slides. And we'll try to send out the slides on our website after this. Okay, and lastly, we have accessibility checks, which ensure that your end result is as accessible as possible. These reviews check that your designs include things such as alternative text, proper color contrast, and even the intensity of your animation, navigation accessibility, and content structure. It's recommended that you conduct accessibility checks with those who have experience using tools such as screen readers or using keyboards to navigate through websites, since they're more experienced in using that. But if you're not able to gather those participants, feel free to check out some tools we listed. So we have the Web Accessibility Evaluation tool. And for that, you just simply input the URL of a website you would like to check, and it'll automatically kind of read out any errors you may have. We also have the Webflow Accessibility Checklist, which is in the image on this slide. So Webflow is like a website building platform, but you can use this checklist even if you aren't building a website on Webflow. So it's just going to give you a list of all of the things that would make your website more accessible, as well as any details that go beyond it. And you can kind of just check it off and make sure that your website or your landing page or whatever is accessible as possible.
Okay, so we'd like to do a short activity, a two-part activity. The first part involves thinking about how to make physical products more inclusive for individuals who are left-handed. So you can think about any product that you use that you notice might not be inclusive for left-handed people, such as maybe a notebook or a can opener, and think about maybe how you would redesign it or make any changes to it to make it more accessible for left-handed people or more inclusive for them. Penning that doesn't smear, yeah. Any other examples? This is why I kind of like notebooks that aren't spiral bound, because it's like easier to write if you're left-handed. Left-handed doorknobs. Yes. Yeah, these are all great examples. Scissors, yep. Yeah, these are great. Okay, yeah, awesome ideas, guys. We'll move on to the second part. If no one has any more, credit card swipers are always on the right. Yes, they are. That's why the ones that are just the insert ones are better. That's a good one. All right.
And so for the next activity, we'll be walking through how we could make Wordle more accessible. So if you don't know what Wordle is, it's a small, or not small, it's a word game that's been popping off recently. So the goal of the game is to kind of guess a 5-letter word. You have 6 tries. Any letters that are correctly guessed included in the actual word are highlighted in yellow, while correct words in the correct place are highlighted in green. And so here's a snapshot of what the results look like. But these results are actually not that accessible. It's a little bit difficult to understand what the results mean with screen readers. Those who do use screen readers tend to get a spam of white emoji, yellow square emoji, like white square emoji, and it just continues. And it is a little bit troublesome for those who have screen readers to kind of access posts, since it can take up to a minute to even get through an entire post with a screen reader. Additionally, it could be difficult to distinguish colors for those who may have color blindness. It might be difficult for them to kind of tell which tiles are yellow and which one are green. So for this activity, we'll be using a website called wa11y.co. And it has a little tool that helps with Wordle accessibility. So the first step is to take a screenshot of your results once you've pasted it. And you're going to be taking a photo of just the results of the squares / emojis as shown in the image example. And then after you take a screenshot, you can discard this post because we'll make a new one later. Okay, now you're going to go back to the website we just talked about. You're going to paste in your Wordle score on the left, and on the right, the website will give you output that is more accessible, and it'll kind of just provide alternative text that describes each row of lines. So you could see line 1 has nothing, and then it explains that in line 4 you won the game. Okay, and now you're going to create a new blank post, and then you're going to add the screenshot of the score from earlier. And then you're going to select the option to add alternative text, and then you'll input the output from the website as alternative text. So you can see here we have the screenshot, and then underneath that we have a description, which is just the alternative text as provided from the website. And now you're done, and you have an accessible Wordle results post. If you'd like to view the demo, we've linked it in the slides, so feel free to check it out on YouTube.
All right, lastly, let's talk about inclusive design versus accessibility. So as a designer, you might confuse accessibility with inclusive design. Inclusive design is the methodology that enables and draws on the full range of human diversity. So as we discussed, in practice, it looks like including and learning from people with a wide range of perspectives, and designing a number of ways for people with different abilities to participate. Accessibility, on the other hand, is an attribute rather than a method. So to help clarify, think of inclusive design as a process and accessibility as a result of an inclusive design process. So at the end of the day, an accessible product is a result of utilizing this process. All right, if you haven't checked in from Rice yet, there's a QR code that you can go ahead and sign in. But other than that, thank you all so much for coming. I hope you all learned about inclusive design, and are there any questions?